In the last video, we saw how we can get buttons to work on a GUI. What we're going to do now is see how we can get radio buttons. And radio buttons are basically what you see in front of you. You have different options, and the user can select which option they want from the list. So this is called a radio button. So the class that's associated with them in Java is JRadioButton. So we can use JRadioButtons to create them. There are two constructors that we will be using. There's one constructor that just takes the text that appears next to the radio button. And there's another constructor that takes the text and a Boolean that says whether it's selected or not by default when you create it. So if you have like one button that you want to have selected by default, you can pass in a true to the selected Boolean. So here are two examples of how to create them. Now let's go to our code and try creating a radio button. So let's just remind ourselves of what the GUI that we had implemented last class looked like. So we had two text boxes for the user to type in some numbers, and then they were able to either select add or multiply. Okay, so instead of those two buttons, add and multiply, what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert them to radio buttons. So I'm going to come here, and where I have my two buttons, so here we have the code to register the action listener. We're going to take that out. Instead of two buttons, button 1 and button 2, I'm going to create some JRadio buttons. So I'm going to come here, instead of those radio buttons, I'm going to turn them into, instead of buttons, I'm going to turn them into JRadio buttons. And for now, I'm just going to call them button 1 and 2, so I have less code to worry about. And let's import JRadio button. Okay. And I'm going to come here, and instead of creating a button, I'm going to create a JRadio button. And this one's also a JRadio button. And for now, I'm going to remove the action listener because we're going to learn how to do it in a different way. So now I have two radio buttons. If I run my GUI now, I should have two radio buttons, and they should have the add and multiply. Okay. Now here, what I have is the ability to actually uncheck both or check both, which is something that I really don't want to do. We should be able to check one, and if the other gets checked, it toggles. So somehow these two buttons are not associated with each other. Now let's have the add be on by default. So let's turn this one to true, and let's just test it again. So now the add nums is the one that's selected by default. What I want to do is when I select one, the other gets deselected. To accomplish that, what we need to do is create a button group and add those radio buttons to the button group. And that's it, basically. What you still add to your GUI is still the buttons. So here I have 3 radio buttons. I'm still adding my buttons to the panel. But this button group has the logic that says when one of these buttons that are added in me gets selected, deselect the others. So I'm going to have to create a button group. So just to make things a little bit more fun, we're going to add a third button. So I'm just going to have JRadio button. Well, let's actually do it right. Button 3 equal to new JRadio button. And let's have a subtract. Let's just go add that up all the way at the top so our code compiles. So we have 3 buttons. Let's create our third JRadio button. And let's have string subtract. Okay. Now, what I want is all of these 3 buttons to be, 3 JRadio buttons to be associated with each other. So I'm going to create a button group for my 3 radio buttons. And all I have to do is create the button group. Let's call it button group equal new button group. I have to add them. So I'm just going to go to my button group and say add button 1. And let's just copy this. and add button 2 and button 3. And I need to make sure that it's imported. So we want to just import everything. So let's just turn this into asterisk. And here, let's make sure that this is asterisk also so that it imports everything for us. Okay. So now if I go down, my button group has been created and I added 3 JRadioButtons to it. I didn't modify the code that was adding to the panel. So adding to the panel, I'm still adding the JRadioButtons to the panel. So let me just add button 3 here too, so we have it. Let's see what it's going to look like now. So by default, the add nums is selected because that's what I gave a true value to. Now when I click on multiply, add gets deselected. And whatever I click on, the others are getting deselected. And this is coming from the effect of the button group. So the button group is the one that's doing this logic so that when one of them gets selected, the others gets deselected. So when one button gets selected, the others get deselected. So this is why we need this button group. Okay, so adding them is not hard. Here is just an example where I creating some JRadioButtons that will control, what color to, here's an example of just creating some JRadioButtons and I'm changing the colors of the backgrounds. Now, what will happen when one of those JRadioButton buttons get clicked? It will fire an event, and the listener that we need to implement for the JRadioButton is very similar to the button. It's the action listener. So if I go back to the code that we had written for the button before, we had implemented a class called button handler that implements action listener, and it had an action performed method. And so the same thing that we did for our buttons, we need to do for our JRadioButtons. So we need to add those action listeners like we did before. So my action listeners there, I just need to register my button handler. So I'm going to go back up here and I'm going to create the button handler. So create the action listener. So I have my button handler, BH equal new button handler. And then I'm going to go to every one of these buttons and register them. So I'm going to register my button handler. So I'm going to go to button 1 and say register. Sorry, not register, add action listener, the button handler. And I'm going to do that for all of them. I'm going to do it for button 1, button 2, and button 3. Now let's go and modify our code to work for subtraction also. So right now we have, if the command is add string, we need else if command equals, this is the multiply, the string multiply. And then I can have one for the subtract case. I'm just going to copy this code. Right, for subtraction. I'm going to get both of them and I'm just going to do a subtraction. Let's test it out. So now I have 20 and 10. If I say multiply, it's 200. If I say add, it's 30. If I say subtract, it's 10, and it keeps changing depending on what I click. Okay, so implementing the action listener for radio buttons is exactly the same as we did for the buttons. Now, you can also ask a button if it's selected or not. So what I could have done inside my button handler, instead of relying, so what we could do is get the event, the source of the event, using the J button. We could use the command that's there. So that's another way that we could do it. A third way we could do it is check what is selected by default. I'm just going to comment this code out, and instead I'm going to copy it again and do it just a slightly different way. So here, what I'm going to do, instead of relying on the command that's coming from my action performed method, the action event here, which has two things, the get source method and the get action command, instead of relying on those, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to see which button is selected. So I'm going to go and say if button 1 is selected. If button 1 is selected, I'm going to do the adding. Otherwise, if button 2 is selected, I'm going to do the multiplication. Otherwise, I'm going to do the subtraction. Let's see if that works. And so the numbers again. And if I click on multiply, it's 200, subtract is working, and adding is working. So all of them are working. So you can actually go to a button and ask it if it's selected or not. That's one way we could do it. Now, you noticed that when we launched our GUI, the add was already selected, but there was no answer. If I want to force the code to select a button or click a button, I can go to a button and say, click yourself. Do click. So here what I'm going to do is in my panel, before I exit, I'm going to go ask button 1 to be clicked. So it clicks itself. So I'm going to go to button 1 and say do click. So you can kind of like select, make something get clicked automatically. And it crashes. It crashes because it went into my action perform. Let's see how to read this, by the way. So here it's showing me that in 17.3 in my main, I called my window, which called here the constructor, which called the build panel, and the build panel called the do click. And then in a little bit, you will see that it comes back to my code and it shows in blue. So now it's showing in my code. So all this code in the middle is kind of the action, the event being fired up and created, and all the background things happening before my interface gets called. But now again, it's coming to my code at line 140, and it's saying try to get the text in the text box, and there is nothing. So here it actually did come. It realized that button 1 was clicked, but unfortunately we don't have any text. So what I can do here is just to make sure that my code doesn't crash, I'm going to say if text 1 dot get text is equal to null, or 1 dot get text is equal to the empty space, then I'm just gonna, well, actually no, we don't want to do that because we want actually numbers. So let's use a try catch. So let's add a try in here. The exception. And I'm going to catch all exceptions. And I'm going to pop up a window that says, so I'm going to create a J option pane dot show message dialog. Must enter numbers. And what doesn't it like here? We need to import exception. Oh, variable E is already defined. Let's use EE. Okay, so now this was going to catch the exception, but really we don't want our we don't want this to happen. Okay, so now it just said must enter numbers. So this is not really what we want. So the do click here in this case is not going to be working. Okay, so I don't want to put it now, but you know, this is how you can force a button to be clicked.